In this lesson, I want to talk about the players in climate negotiation. And I think the key thing to remember when we're talking about players in climate negotiation is that everyone is different, so they will come from different places and we'll need to manage them somewhat differently as well. So the lesson objectives are to understand that there are different players at the table, to gain a high-level understanding of the key motivations for each player, and to finally understand that different players require different approaches. And this is key in negotiation. If you understand who you're talking to and the kinds of things that they need to hear, that makes negotiation process a lot easier. I'm going to consider 10 key players in climate negotiation. There are actually other people who will occasionally come in and out of the discussion, but they tend to have less impact. So for the purpose of this lesson, I'm focusing on the 10 key players. And for each player, I'm going to answer 5 questions. What is their motivation? How do they see themselves? How do others perceive them? What do they offer in the negotiation? And what impact can they have? And finally, some key thoughts around what we should do about it when we're dealing with different players at the table. Well, the first people up are trolls. And I think Mark Twain said this best. Never argue with an idiot. They will drag you down to their level and then beat you with experience. So when it comes to trolls, we need to understand that these people make negotiation difficult and may ultimately be not negotiable at all. So what's their motivation? For a lot of these people, it's just for fun, what we like to call the low-key syndrome. They just want to create mischief, and that's why they're there. Sometimes it's paid advocacy. Sometimes they're just being bloody-minded, just for the sake of being mean. But overall, it tends to give them a sense of power, so it empowers them to be able to do these things. So how do they see themselves? Invariably, they see themselves as being very smart, actually smarter than the average duck. And they see themselves as being tricksters. So how does that translate into how others may see them? Well, unfortunately, a lot of folks see them as being reliable and sometimes even funny. So that's one of the reasons why they can survive. And oftentimes they're seen by folks who are serious about the negotiations just being an aggravation. They're just in the way. So what do they offer? Well, not usually very much of any value. And oftentimes, despite the fact that they think or feel that they're very smart, they have little relevant skill or knowledge to offer to the discussion. So what's the impact? Well, they divert and they delay. And they oftentimes have influence on unknowledgeable people. So folks who don't know much different will tend to listen to a troll. Now, that can be very dangerous because misinformation can lead to serious mistakes. And my advice comes right back to the very beginning is never argue with a troll. It's just a waste of time. Well, next people that I like to consider are scientists and engineers. Kurt Vonnegut said, "Science is magic that works." And that kind of carries through with the way a lot of people will see scientists. So what's the motivation of these scientists and engineers? Well, we like to understand why and how things work. We're driven by precision, and we like to be right. So a lot of that drives the way we do things. And how do we see ourselves? Typically smart, educated, and more often than not, inquisitive. But here's the key. How do others see us? Oftentimes, the average person sees the scientist or the engineer as being aloof and arrogant, and oftentimes as impractical eggheads. And so we need to be aware that the fight, despite the fact that we're worried about precision and correctness, and we see ourselves as being smart, other folks can see us as being very impractical and sort of out of it a bit. Well, what do scientists and engineers offer? Specialized knowledge. I mean, scientists and engineers just know stuff that the rest of us need to know. They offer understanding the issues, and they oftentimes can offer solutions. Now, what's the impact? Well, not as great as it should be often, because of this view that they are aloof and arrogant and impractical. A lot of their advice is discounted as impractical, and that they're elitist. So it's not real world enough for a lot of folks. So how do we deal with it? Well, when I'm dealing with a scientist or an engineer, I like to engage and encourage. And then I encourage them to explain what they're saying in layman language. And ultimately, as a negotiator, I see part of my role is to help them to translate. So explain what they're saying and translate that into language the average person can get. Bankers, financiers, and insurers. And just, we understand that money makes the world go around. So these people are key players at the table. But what's their motive? Well, for the most part, these folks see themselves in it for the profit. And how do they see themselves? Wise decision makers, practical risk managers. So, they see the issues. They when they manage risk, they manage it from a financial perspective, and they see themselves in wisely managing their money and the money of others. Well, how do other folks see them? Typically conservative. We see them as risk averse. And they also have a tendency to use incomprehensible language. They talk about futures and derivatives and the like. And that, for the average person, just a little bit difficult to understand. But they do have a lot to offer because they understand how to motivate change through capital. So they know how to use money to affect change. And that's an important thing in climate negotiation. And their impact? Very large. They influence where the money goes. So these people are key players in climate negotiation. So what do? We need to engage, and we need to show them the financial risk of climate change so they understand and can build that consideration into their wise decision making. But we also need to encourage them to see the human side of the issue, that these decisions will affect people's lives. And even though there may not be a direct financial benefit to that, it's nonetheless important. And finally, we just need to be patient with these folks. They're important and they need to be at the table. They control what we spend money on. So we need to be patient and encourage them to engage and be part of the discussion. Industrialists and developers. Henry Ford said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So what motivates an industrialist or a developer? They see themselves as world changers, changing the world, putting money to work. They see themselves as being smart, persistent, entrepreneurial, and visionary. But how do the rest of us see them? Well, oftentimes bullheaded and too willing to risk other people's money. And because entrepreneurialism tends to be paved with a lot of failures that lead to success, oftentimes we see them as being too willing, that is, to accept failure on the way to success. So those are the way we see them. What do they offer? Well, actually, they're important too because they offer new and better ways to get things done. And so in that regard, their impact can be huge. So what do we need to do? Once again, these are folks that we need to engage with. We need to work with them. We have to show them what the opportunities are. And we have to be willing to brainstorm with them to develop those opportunities. We can work with their dogged determination because once they start moving, they can be very hard to stop. Well, politicians. Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it, incorrectly that is, and applying the wrong remedies. Well, if you think about what motivates a politician, I like to use the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule. In essence, they're looking at three things. They're looking at good policy, 1/3, their ability to be reelected, 1/3, and satisfying their contributors because the money drives the election. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So they may well speak about policy and they mean it, but they also worry about being reelected and their contributors. So how do they see themselves? Invariably, they see themselves as statesmen who guide the electorate and visionary. Well, then how do the rest of us see them? As a necessary evil, typically, arrogant and unapproachable, and oftentimes impractical. If you watch the response to the COVID-19 crisis, there was a lot of discussion about that wasn't the right motion, the right tactic, that didn't work, and they're not listening and that sort of thing. So we tend to see them that way. They offer regulation and policy that motivates real change, so they're important as well. And their impact can be very large. And that makes policy that can motivate progress. So that they drive what we actually do in that regard. Well, what do we need to do? I think it's important that we remember the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule. And we need to show how good policy can impact their contributions and their reelection. And that's really the key to motivating them. And then they will do the good policy stuff that we want to get done. Well, bureaucrats are a different category altogether. One of our two greatest problems are gravity and paperwork. And we can lick gravity, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming. So said Wernher von Braun. Well, what's the motivation? Well, I've dealt with a lot of bureaucrats over the years. I was one for a while myself. Clearly, most of the time they're motivated by public service and almost equally security. So they want to do what's right for the public, and they're worried about security. And how do they see themselves? Invariably, underpaid and underappreciated. They see themselves as diligent professionals and as being knowledgeable. And in contrast, how do we see them? Overpaid. So they see themselves as being underpaid. We see them as being overpaid, officious, and oftentimes rule-bound and obstructive. Remember that a bureaucrat's job is to enforce the rules, so we will see them as being rule-bound. Well, what do they offer? They're important to us because they understand how government actually works, and they can get things done for us. And so their impact can be large. What do we need to do? Well, we need to work with the bureaucrats. We have to help them identify how progress fits within the rule set that they work within. Never threaten a bureaucrat. Be careful about going over their head. And if you're finding that you're negotiating hard and nothing's happening and they keep playing the game I call agent of limited authority, then perhaps you are talking to the wrong bureaucrat. So sometimes it's a matter of finding the right one to talk to, being careful once again to not step on somebody's toes on the way through. So they require a bit of tact. They're important. They understand how government works, and we need to work with them. Lobbying is the world's second oldest profession. So lobbyists are with us. In a democratic system, lobbyists are just going to be there. So what's their motivation? We need to remember that lobbyists are paid to lobby. They may not actually be representing their own view in this. They see themselves as being professional, connected, as being consultants, and kingmakers. How do the rest of us see them? Well, oftentimes as backroom boys. They're just in it for the money. Untrustworthy and untruthful. And what do they offer? They provide access to paying contributors. So they actually are the link between the message and the person who's paying for that message. So we need to pay attention to that. And they can have large impact because of that. They do influence who gets elected. What we need to do is find the person who hired them and work there. These people, lobbyists, they're not paid to negotiate. So negotiating with them is not typically all that fruitful. We need to find out the person who hired them and negotiate there. Environmental is a special category close to my heart. Greta Thunberg said it the best: we can't change the world by playing by the rules have to be changed. And I think it's important, these first 2 points. Why? What motivates an environmentalist, and how do they see themselves? They're motivated by saving the world. And they see themselves as enlightened purists. Now that's important. I'll come back to that in a moment. How do others see them? Typical tree-hugging radicals, out of touch with the real world. But they do offer something that we need in climate negotiation. They offer us vision, and they give us direction. But unfortunately, I think their impact tends to be moderate. While they show the path, it normally takes other folks to execute the concrete action. And there's a reason for that, and I'll come back to that. So what do we need to do? I think it's important that we listen to and talk to environmentalists. We need to get a sense of the vision. And then we need to work with them toward the vision. But here's where the rubber hits the road. We need to be patient. They see themselves as enlightened purists. It's normal for them to move the goalposts when things start to happen. So, in essence, nothing is ever pure enough for a true environmentalist. So as we start to move in a direction towards purity, then they will up the ante to make it more pure. And that's normal for them. And that's one of the reasons I said that their impact tends to be moderate. They do show the path. But once again, we need to work with their vision and then make it more concrete, working with the rest of the players at the table. Reporters. In any environmental negotiation, any climate change negotiation, we are going to be dealing with reporters. So I'm afraid we'll see reporters stop chasing quotes around the same time dogs stop chasing cars. I mean, they're looking for a good soundbite. So what's their motivation? Well, a good reporter is actually looking for a good story to feed the news cycle. They want to get it into the news cycle. And how do they see themselves? Honest, purveyors of the truth that others don't want to share. And the key point here is don't want to share, so they will dig for it. How do the rest of us see them? Well, if you've ever dealt with a reporter and watched what you've said being translated into the story, you will tend to have the feeling that they've been shallow and inaccurate. They're only in it for the soundbite. And they are slanted. They look at it from a particular point of view, and that's the point of view they report. But they are interesting players at the table because at best they can provide a concise picture of what's really going on. And in the worst case, they can be entertainment. Even so, their impact can be very large because that concise picture or that entertainment forms public opinion. And so we need to be aware that their impact can be quite significant. Well, although it's tempting, never lie to a reporter. And I would argue also, never claim to be an expert. Let them tell the world you're an expert. Don't you tell them. Then think twice. Speak once. There is no such thing as off the record. And remember that. There is no such thing as off the record. In my media training back in the day, that was the one thing that they hammered on us over and over again. Never let a reporter take you into their confidence and say it's off the record. It will show up in the story one way or another. So, their impact can be large. We need to pay attention to them. They see themselves as being honest purveyors of the truth, and we need to work with them to affect public opinion. Now, the rest of us. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed, organized citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Well, the first thing is they recognize that we're all citizens. So this is kind of speaking to the choir here a bit. But what motivates a citizen when they're wearing their citizen hat? So a scientist may say, oh, I'm thinking like a citizen, but they're actually wearing the science hat. When you're thinking like a normal, average person as a citizen, what's your motivation? And typically, almost universally, home, hearth, family, and jobs. How do we see ourselves? Well, largely as protectors of the family, as breadwinners, taxpayers, We all pay too much. We are the people who do the living, working, and dying in this town. So how do others see us? Well, it varies from being salt of the earth to gullible masses. So we need to understand that other players can look at the average person and see them in a very different light. Well, what do we offer? Any real action requires organized citizen involvement. That's how we get there at the end. And so the impact is very large. And what do we need to do? Well, I started this part of the lecture with saying we're all citizens, and I say it again. We are all citizens, so we need to participate in this. And we need to listen. We need to identify our concerns and others' concerns. And we need to share our own worries and issues. We need to find the common ground. And in my experience, it's always there. So overall, we're not all the same. Different players have different perspectives, needs, and objectives. And we need to engage with different players in different ways. So in this lesson, what did we cover? I contemplated different players at the table. We looked at 10 different players and we thought about how they might be managed slightly differently. We considered the high-level understanding of the key motivations for each player. And then we talked about different ways and approaches for dealing with them. As always, feel free to comment below. We will review your comments and share them with the rest of the participants and engage in a meaningful ongoing discussion about this issue.